We've all been there, whether it's SimCity, City Skylines, Minecraft, or some other world-building game. We've at one point decided to toggle that unlimited resources button and go God mode with our imagination, making the most grandiose idiocy possible. Some can be super creative and downright hilarious. The incredible world building has led to some super interesting creations and even mini communities. And because we have unlimited money and basically have turned on God mode, we use destructive processes to achieve these goals, often flattening out or removing existing natural and built form landscapes in pursuit of our aims.
Move your goddamn house, Dad!
But what if we actually did it in real life? Let's be honest, people with the ultimate power have done such a thing in the past, most notably the Roman Empire, but someone decided they wanted to outdo that. Well, who do we know that has such unrestricted power to bulldoze, access to an obscene amount of funds, and a point to prove? That's right, Bob the Adolf. Old mate Adolphin had the same idea as many people with the unlimited funds cheat toggle, and like all things he touched, honestly he took it too far. He got his right-hand man, Speer, to redesign Berlin and other cities in Germany. He wanted to create a capital that would be the envy of the world right in the middle of Berlin, called Germania, to exude the Aryan and Nazi values and be as physically imposing as possible, to host his hour-long lectures and battlefield simulators, basically letting the world know he's original in his endeavours. This wasn't going to be some cute little village city, no, it was going to be a dick measuring contest. The whole of Berlin and other German cities would be redesigned with massive buildings, bigger than the biggest of buildings. Now, these city designs were quite involved, and I won't go into all of this in this video, but I'll mostly be talking about the centre of the masterpiece, the north-south axis. Going from the north of Berlin around the historic and still standing Reichstag, he would have bulldozed a huge boulevard through existing buildings, south towards the now Südkreuz station, and lined with monumental government buildings, and the centrepiece being this massive hall for 180,000 people called the Volkshalle, at the top of the axis, adjacent to the current-day Reichstag. And on the southern end, a 400-metre wide open space to house the artillery pieces of the conquered nations adjacent to the planned South Cross station, with an Arc de Triomphe-like structure, but 3 times as big. So what would this new grandiose boulevard have been like? It may have been hard to imagine how something so obtuse and massive in scale might appear in modern day, but actually we don't need to imagine much. Because like many other things, Hitler wasn't the first to do it. And something similar is in the exact same spot for decades before the 1940s. The east-west axis, running immediately next to the current-day Reichstag. The east-west axis, also known as the 17. Julistrasse, that goes west towards Charlottenburg from the Brandenburg Gate, and the famous Unten den Linden, which is the traditional main street of modern Berlin that goes east from the Brandenburg Gate towards the famous Berlin TV Tower. With its history stretching back hundreds of years as a main thoroughfare from the city centre towards the Tiergarten, one by one important government buildings began to pop up, such as universities, embassies, palaces, and monuments. By the time the Nazis came to power, Unten den Linden already served as a somewhat example of how the planned north-south axis would be, but it received some minor remodelling, with the streets being widened all the way to Charlottenburg and the Siegersäule being shifted to the halfway point between Brandenburg Gate and Charlottenburg. The proposal was so massive and required an immense amount of planning and engineering to make sure these sketches were actually feasible. After all, much like Hyperloop CGI, you can draw anything you like on paper. The Nazis weren't sure themselves if the massive proposed buildings were possible to build on the soft, marshy Berlin ground, as the building's weights were to be off the charts heavy. Particularly one building, the Triumphal Arch, which was to be more than 2.5 times the size of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. So they decided to test the ground by building the Schwerbelastungskörper, or in English, the big chunkus of concrete, to test the subsidence into the ground over time, as it was to be a long-term project, and they had time to test this whilst they were still designing the thing and digging the foundations. Speer estimated that if the building sank no more than 6 centimeters, the ground would be stable enough. However, by the end of the 1945, the structure sank by 19 centimeters, which is not too much of an issue if you have more Polish volunteers to dig deeper foundations. The area surrounding the Spree, known as the Spreebogen today, was populated with mostly diplomatic buildings from many different countries, including the Ukrainian embassy of 1918 to 1923. Well, the Nazis decided the land those buildings were on top of served the greater national interest and assumed control of them, as well as deeming the buildings surplus to requirements, slating them for destruction, which the English happily obliged to do with bombing runs, with the Nazis jokingly saying the English are doing the demolition for them. Although there was one building that withstood the Nazis in the war, somehow the Swiss embassy dodged the literal bombings and bulldozers to stand alone in a now empty space, surviving the assault on the Reichstag by the Soviets and still remaining somewhat alone to this day. Although during World War II, the building was vacated by the Swiss embassy workers, so they were safe in their mountain bunkers. Work began rather quickly on the Volkshalle foundations, which were to be located on the river Spree, and as you might expect, it's difficult to build over a river. So the Nazis opted to re-divert the river Spree past the Reichstag and then build the Volkshalle over the original path. Construction on the project began quite quickly, with the diversions dug out. Interestingly enough, in the game War Thunder, the area is modelled quite accurately, with the pit in the middle. However, as the war progressed and more valuable resources, such as Polish volunteers, diverted towards a war effort, construction quickly stalled. During the last stand of the Germans at the Reichstag in Berlin during World War II, the half-dug-out foundations of the Spree diversion pit served as a useful defensive barrier for the Germans against the Russian assault by being flooded on purpose, forcing them to either cross open ground or fight through destroyed buildings whilst getting belted by Flak 88 fire from the Zoo Flak Tower. But what about this curved line cutting directly across the open pit that you eagle-eyed viewers have probably seen numerous times? Is that an extension of the last stand water barrier? Not quite. Although master plan megalomania or appendage measuring capital city projects usually turn out to be inhuman-sized non-functional rubbish that prioritise a main boulevard, large inaccessible buildings and car-centric transport planning, Speer and his team didn't completely buy this idea. The world before World War II was already moving towards an auto-centric design, evident in the likes of Garden City design, City Beautiful movement, and architect Le Corbusier proposing massive inner-city highways and building layouts that belong to Microsoft Flight Simulator 2000, set the foundations for a major shift in urban planning principles towards heavy car dependence. Although the current dystopian car-centrism we know today didn't really accelerate until after World War II, major cities around the world before 1945 were becoming increasingly clogged with cars, sparking the fight for public space, where vulnerable road users were metaphorically and physically pushed out of public space access and roads. The Germans did follow this car-centric mindset to some degree, hence Das Volkswagen und die Autobahn. However, Speer did recognise the reliance on the effective public transport system of Berlin and opted to incorporate it into his designs. Speer made provisions for a rail line going from the current-day Hauptbahnhof, formerly Lauterbahnhof, to under the proposed Great Hall and then run further underneath the proposed north-south axis, passing by the Tempelhofer Feld and continuing into the Berlin southern suburbs. The proposed line would also be crisscrossed by the S-Bahn and other U-Bahn lines at various points to make large public transport stations. Such a transit system is somewhat befitting and a future-proofing to cater for the high amount of expected visitors to the area, able to whisk people quickly between major points in Berlin, directly into the heart of Nazi propaganda-shaped monoliths. Though it must be said, this wasn't a one-off investment to make their grand plan look all great and functional, with the rest of the network to be neglected. Speer and his team had in fact massively invested in the Berlin public transport system, particularly before the 1936 Olympic Games, with their most notable addition being the elimination of nearly all terminus S-Bahn train stations in the city by constructing the north-south S-Bahn tunnel underneath the city streets, making through lines for most commuter rails, improving the capacity. There are numerous other public project additions that were originally planned or built as part of the Grand Berlin, but that can be the subject of another video. Anyway, back to the north-south axis. As I said before, it must be said that though Speer wasn't immune from car mania, given the angry windmill boy based a lot of economic policy on the trussy car, represented as a humble Volkswagen Beetle, and the network of go as fast as you can barns crisscrossing this nation, such things under the eyes of the N-words must be incorporated into the new city vision. So the new north-south axis would receive a wide boulevard strode, if you will, and where it intersects the east-west axis, the modern-day 17. Julistrasse, at the Brandenburg Gate, a classic highway-style fly under. Yes, the NSDAP peers were also car-brained. However, they did one better than the modern-day Americans by putting these ridiculous highway turnpikes completely underground to preserve the aesthetic look of the grand buildings adjacent, like the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate. Actually, they even went as far as to already build some of these underpasses already in a section of the proposed U-Bahn tunnel underneath the east-west axis. However, this construction was stopped due to the aforementioned change in priorities, but not before they were able to experiment on what type of tunnel lighting they should use, so not as to blind the car drivers. These tunnels lay beneath the current-day 17. Julistrasse, and are planned to be accessible through guided tours soon. There are many more signs of former Nazi urban planning remnants, but that might need another trip to Berlin for inspiration. So the next time you're in Berlin, you might find some telltale signs of Nazi urban planning and think, am I in a SimCity simulation?